So yes, I'm going to be talking to you today about secondary poisoning, and it's all a bit of a risky business at the end of the day. By way of introductions, hi everybody, I am Alex Wade. I am BASF's Global Technical Marketing Manager for their rodenticide range. I'm a general know-it-all, I'm a hoarder of useless facts, I can and will derail myself at the drop of a hat, so let's go. What are we going to talk about today? Firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about primary versus secondary poisoning. We're going to get some of those terminologies out of the way. We're going to talk about risk, and then we're going to talk about how we mitigate those risks with our IPM or our integrated risk management. But to start with, possibly as basic as we can possibly make this talk, you have bait, something eats the bait, something eats the something that has eaten the bait. This broadly is primary poisoning, and this is secondary poisoning. We want a little bit more detail than that, I am sure. Okay, so with that, let's have a look at it like this. You have your deployment of bait, and then you'll have a primary poisoning event. Now, that's either going to be the target pest that you want to be controlling, or it's going to be another non-target animal. And then you have your secondary poisoning, and that's where a scavenger or a predator will either eat your target pest or will eat the non-target animal that has eaten your bait. So this is a little bit more detail, but we're going to drill down to this a little bit further as well, because why should we worry about this? Why should this be a concern to us? Let's have a look at primary poisoning first. Let's have a look at primary risks. Now, theoretically, if you use your bait correctly, the first and the only animal to engage with your baits will be the target pest that you are looking to control. However, primary toxicity can also occur when non-target species come into direct contact with and consume your baits. This may occur as a result of users not storing baits properly or the baits not being deployed in a safe and secure manner. Primary non-target animals can be diverse, okay? We can talk small rodents or other wildlife that we don't consider to be pests, domestic animals, livestock animals, or in rare and exceptional circumstances, even human beings. So when we talk of then primary exposure, you have the animals that you are wanting to engage with, your rats and your house mice. And then you have the animals that you do not want to be engaged with at all, your livestock animals, domestic animals, non-target rodent species, even small bird species with that as well. So with this, good, bad. Moving on from that, we have then secondary risks. Firstly, for there to be a secondary risk, the chemical that you are using needs to be bioaccumulative. And by that, it means that even after it's been ingested and then digested, that product hasn't been metabolized and instead is stored within some portion of that animal's body. So secondary toxicity, therefore, is when a non-target species consumes any animal that has eaten a rodenticide bait and carries some of that bait within its tissues. This transfer can occur from both your targets and your non-target animals as well. Predatory animals are going to consume animals that have consumed bait but not yet shown any mortal signs of toxicosis, and scavenging animals will pick up carcasses of animals that have died either as a result of consuming the bait or consumed the bait leading up to that animal's death. The more dead or dying rats and mice or in any other animals that are consumed, the greater the level of secondary poisoning that can occur. But most often than not, secondary poisoning is seen in birds of prey, such as barn owls, kestrels, or in scavenger species such as foxes. CREW, for its Think Wildlife Reporting Scheme, monitored from 2016 to 2021 that anticoagulant rodenticide traces were found in almost 90% of barn owls, demonstrating that there needs to be a lot more work done to reduce the overall risk to non-target species. Now, I don't have a slide for this because there's so many different pie charts out there, but what I would like to say is if you are a nerd like me, you can go out and you can pick up any barn owl pellet out there. So when barn owls consume their prey, they'll digest the most of it, but the fur, the bones, they will regurgitate up as a big pellet, okay? So you can go out and you can find owl vomit if you so wish, and you can pick it apart and you can pull it apart and you can find all of the skulls and the femurs and the various sort of bones within that. and you can find out what species that barn owl has been eating. And overwhelmingly, barn owl diets consist of small rodents, smaller than rats. We are talking field mice, voles, shrews. Now, the big thing you should be saying straight away is they are definitely not our target animals. So if the vast majority of our barn owl diet is non-target animals, then how can almost 90% of the barn owls being tested demonstrate that they are carrying residuals? That's a question you need to ask yourself when you go onto your sites. Think about how these chemicals are moving down the trophic chains. So again, here's some examples of just some animals. We have some kites, which would be scavenging birds. We have our predatory birds, barn owls, predatory mammals, such as our weasels, stoats, and ferrets we find throughout the UK, and then scavenging mammals, such as foxes. Okay, so these are examples of our secondary exposure mechanisms. So there we go, guys. How do we assess what risks we find on our site? And this has worked quite well, hasn't it? Because actually we do an environmental risk assessment, and we'll come into that in a little bit more detail maybe later on. But in reality, what I say is that's it. That's primary and secondary poisoning for you. So thank you ever so much. Thank you for coming to my talk. We'll do some Q&As now. Nah, I joke, because right now Lauren's face is probably doing this because I've been talking for a sum total of 7 minutes. No, let's drill down a little bit more into this, shall we? Because we keep using this word a lot, risk, okay? We talk about risk. We've got primary risks, we've got secondary risks, risk. So what are we talking about when we talk about risk? Because actually risk is a very useful tool, because we have risk hierarchies that we can implement in order to try and mitigate a lot of these potential problems before they even started. So we have our escalation hierarchies and we have our mitigation hierarchies. And our escalation looks like this. This is the one that we were given by crew. You start here, you do your environmental management first, you escalate to physical controls, and then finally you deploy chemical options if these two are insufficient to control your populations. But we have the mitigation hierarchy as well, which is equally useful and a powerful tool when it comes to making decisions as to what tools to use to control an infestation of rodents. And we'll go into this in considerably more detail in just a moment. But first, let's focus on our escalation principle, because what is it and how does it work and what should we be doing? It's based on the crew codes of best practice. And the idea is to have the maximum impact for the minimum cost. Now, when we say impact, we mean impact to that target infestation of rodents. And when we say minimum cost, we're not talking about the financial aspects here. We're actually talking about the cost to non-target animals. And it's interesting to see that even in the crew codes, they say you must choose a strategy that has the lowest impact or the lowest costs. There is never a zero-sum argument here. There is always going to be a risk. The skill as an operator is to bring those risks as close to zero as possible. There's always going to be a cost. Let's say, this is your job, this is your skill, this is what separates you from the rank and file, is your ability to manage and mitigate these risks and to therefore reduce the costs to the environment for undertaking any control program out there. So let's start with the environment first. Making the environment as difficult for that infestation to thrive as is possible. Now, thriving is not the same as surviving. Animals can survive in some of the harshest conditions, but they're going to need a host of factors in order to allow that population to thrive, to grow, and to become problematic. So with that, we can stop these animals thriving, and we can even stop them from surviving in certain situations by removal of excess food, by reducing access to water, albeit we are in the UK, it generally falls out of the sky every 3 days. We can remove access to harbourage as best we can, and we can stop access to our sites where possible, or very least remove the access into buildings as a whole. So this is what we talk about environmental management. And the key takeaway here is to stop them thriving. And if you can be so harsh as well, to stop them surviving in these situations as well. Moving up our escalation principles, we have a look at physical controls. This is controlling. So this moves into the lethal control phase of our escalation principle. And it's controlling a population with non-chemical interventions, the use of traps, rifles, or biologicals such as terriers. Okay? There's no chemicals involved. It's all mechanical action in order to reduce that population down. Now we move on to our chemical controls. And actually, this is any chemical substance that is either ingested, absorbed, or inhaled, which leads to a fatal endpoint. 4 major groups in the UK. There is other bits kicking around as well, but largely speaking, we have our AVKs, that's our first and second generation anticoagulants. We have our calciferols, which is cholecalciferol, our narcoticizing agents, which are things like alpha chlorulose, and our gassing compounds, which we use in our fumigation. And that would be things like aluminium phosphide for the control of moles and for the control of rabbits and rats. So we have our gassing compounds as well. Generally, okay, good first principle to work on the environmental risks first. But does this escalation principle totally mitigate against the risk of primary and secondary? Yes and no, okay? Because when we have a look into how this integrates then into our larger profile, it will only eliminate the risks. You are looking at elimination only. And by far away, elimination is probably the most effective tool at reducing risks, but it is not the most flexible tool. So when we have those times where escalation to chemical control is necessary, how do we then still continue to manage these risks to keep the risks of primary and secondary poisoning lower? So what we're saying here, largely speaking, is this is our elimination phase. Can we get away with not using a chemical control by using either a physical or an environmental management tool in its stead? Now, let's take, for example, and play devil's advocate and say, no, we cannot eliminate the use of chemicals. They are fundamental to this particular control program that I am undertaking. To which point, we can then start to move down this list to try and start managing some of the risks that we find. But elimination, as I said before, is probably by far the best way to manage the risk. You can totally eliminate the risk of secondary poisoning by simply not using a chemical that produces a secondary poisoning effect or using a chemical at all. It's also the most restrictive of our mitigations here because you are wiping out an entire set of tools in order to manage the risk. So it will alter the strategic framework of your program altogether. It's the most effective, but it's going to be the least flexible. As we move down to substitution, this probably is going to be the most powerful tool that we talk about today. But it takes a high level of understanding about the active materials that we have within our toolkit, because substitution is a conversation all around active materials. It's this knowledge combined with your known and assumed risks, which you found on your environmental risk assessment, which will allow you to make the best choice and use the best tool in the best situation. You pick the right active material for the right risk, for the right pest, for the right location. So let's talk about this a little bit more, because we have plenty of solutions. We think that we're quite hamstrung, but actually we have a lot of solutions to hand. We have our alternative modes of action. So we have calciferol, alpha chlorulose. We don't have zinc phosphide in the UK, but it is largely used around the world still. And then we have our AVKs. We have our first generations, we have our multi-feeds, and then we have things like our single feeds, such as flucumaphen in there as well. So we do have quite a broad range of tools at our disposal when we are talking about chemicals. So how do we make the right choice? If we look at AVKs very broadly, and this is broadly because we have a limited amount of time, pros are they're chronic, so you don't get a lot of bait shyness. You can get them in multi-feeds and single feeds. They have resistance issues with multi-feeds, but generally speaking, no resistance issues with the single feeds. They have an antidote, which is vitamin K1. The cons are they are highly bioaccumulative. They will attach themselves to the liver and even fatty tissues very effectively. And it means that animal will contain a level of eschar within its body even after it has died. With things like the calciferols, again, some of our pros overlap here. We've got chronic, no bait shyness. We have no resistance, despite the fact it's a multi-feed. But it has a very low level of bioaccumulation to it. And I'll explain why in a little bit. But there is no antidote. That being said, there is a very comprehensive care and treatment program that you can put in place, but there is no magic button you can give. So you can actually see with the AVKs and the calciferols, there's a bit of an overlap. The risks of one overlap with the pros of the others. You might then think then these are probably best to use when the primary risk is going to be greater, whereas your calciferols may be better to use when the secondary risks are greater. Now, a quick bit of a question for you here. When it comes to accidental ingestion, what is the safe limit of bait to be consumed? Well, the answer there is never to be assumed a safe limit. And in fact, assuming that there is a safe limit, I'm going to be controversial here, I'm going to say is lazy thinking, because there are always risks. And you shouldn't rely on a hypothetical limit to mitigate these risks as far as possible. You should do everything else in your power to mitigate these risks, to make it, I was about to use the word safe, we never use the word safe, to make it less risky. Okay? So, isn't cholecalciferol bioaccumulative? Isn't it just a fancy next-gen rodenticide like the rest? Well, actually, no. So calciferol is a totally different mode of action. It's not just a different product, it's a completely different effect on the body, okay? Using things like cholecalciferol, if you use it like you use any other rodenticide bait, it will still work, but you won't get the maximum benefits from it. You'll encounter more difficulties, and you may, as a result, even increase the risks to your site. How it works, different from the AVKs, is it mobilizes calcium stores from within the bones and from within the nervous system, and it will move it through the body. And these calcium is then deposited into places like the kidneys, into the livers, even into the lung, into the gut, and the animal dies from hypercalcemia. There are some additionals to it, and we'll pick up on these later, which is actually cholecalciferol has this stop feed effect. It produces a loss of appetite within the animal, and it makes it lethargic as well. Why it is not bioaccumulative, which is the big question asking me, is because when you start with your initial compound, cholecalciferol, when it then moves into the body and moves into the liver, it's instantly metabolized, and it moves to a chemical called calcidol. And then when it moves into the kidneys, it then is further metabolized down again. This is the toxic component. These are not, which means that it is toxic upon ingestion, but it is readily metabolized. And as it is being metabolized, that is when it is having its lethal effect. After it has been metabolized, after it's moved from cholecalciferol to its metabolites, these are no longer toxic, which means that any animal that consumes a rodent, a rat or a mouse that is already suffered the lethal effects of cholecalciferol, it's only going to contain these metabolites. So the risk of bioaccumulation and the risk of secondary poisoning are significantly lower. So that's our substitution done. We've talked about substitution. Do we want to use AVKs? Do we want to use calciferols? Do I have a higher risk of primary poisoning? Do I have a higher risk of secondary poisoning? Choose accordingly. Our engineering controls are how we then present that active material in our formulations. Different formulations are also going to present different levels of risk. And this is going to be probably of greatest concern when we talk about our primary exposures. Because within this, a loose formulation, let's say, runs the risk of spillage if that container replacement is not deployed and it is not secured in place. Block formulations can indeed be much more secure. However, if they're not secured in place, or if they're secured in place and left and not observed, they can become victim to what we call bait dragging. And that's where an entire block or an entire sachet can be removed from a bait placement and moved away to an unsecure location. So not only do we need to pick the right formulation for the situation, but we now need to factor in as well that we need to come back at a visit frequency dependent on risk. If you've got a lot of animals, if you've going to have a lot of juvenile animals looking to cache food, then you're going to need to come back more often. So you can assess the condition of your placements to reduce these risks as a result. Reduce the risks of your boxes getting knocked over and bait being spilled onto the floor, reducing the risks of bait dragging occurring and bait being exposed to non-target animals. Process is our strategy, okay? Our baiting strategy, should I say, to be more effective. How often do you replenish your baits? How much bait do you put in a placement? Does the strategy have longer term goals, or is it a short-term eradication? Am I just asking a lot of rhetorical questions right now? Yes, but also we can have a look at these strategies because there are several well-documented strategies that we can draw on. And these are not just theoretical. This isn't just some Herbert like me sat in a lab devising interesting strategies and try to shoehorn them into conversations. They have been empirically proven in the field to have a significant impact on the length of time it takes to control a population. Okay. So why do we use them? Why don't we use them? Because let's be honest, we all use just the one strategy. Fill the boxes up, kill the rats, empty the boxes, walk away. Fill the boxes up, kill the rats, walk away. Why make things complicated? Generally, it can be difficult to explain to your clients why you are doing this novel approach. You can make them work with brute force, okay? It's not elegant, but it will work. But I think more and far and away is we fear that if we make things complicated, we're going to make them commercially unviable. It's going to get in the way of making money. And at the end of the day, everyone listening to this, you are pest controllers, you are business owners, you are there to make money. You are there to provide a public service to safeguard the environment and the public. But you've also got to look after yourself. So I think this is probably the biggest drawback, is people worry about using novel strategies because they fear it will make your treatment commercially unviable. And that is not necessarily true. And let's talk about some of these strategies, because this is how we can communicate them, how we can pick the right one to mitigate the risks. We have 3 known and documented baiting strategies. We have saturation baiting, we have pulse baiting, and we have speed baiting. And they all work best if you are using different chemicals or different active materials. So to start with saturation baiting first, because this is the one we all use. This is the one that we know and we like. And it basically requires a continuous supply of bait available on the site. It's required for rats to eat consistently in order to achieve a lethal dose. Baits must remain available for the rats for the whole period of treatment, which can potentially be 21 days or more. Having bait down all the time, though, having bait down at all points during your treatment is going to necessarily increase the risk of primary poisoning, simply just by the law of averages. The more you have down and the longer you have it down, the greater the risk of the wrong animal finding that bait in amongst the right animals. The bioaccumulative effects of these are also exaggerated, because often with a saturation baiting technique, that animal is going to consume multiple lethal doses, which will then therefore increase your secondary poisoning risks as well. Because if you think about it, let's take something like difenicum and rats. A rat will eat about 30 grams of food a day. Let's be generous and say they're going to eat from your bait half of the time, and they're going to be continuing snuffling through the box of Snickers in the storeroom the other half of the time. They're eating 15 grams a day. It takes 10 grams of difenicum to kill a rat on average. It means that they're going to have a lethal feed in one day. But we've got that 3 to 5 day lag period, which means that actually they'll continue eating 15 grams the following day and the following day and the following day and the following day, which means that you have 4, 5, 6 lethal doses within that animal. And as I said before, it'll bind to the liver, it'll bind to the fat cells. In fact, the more you have, the greater these secondary poisoning risks occur. And as you move up through the escalation of potency, the greater that accumulation becomes. So how this works? Well, it's essential. So Adrian Mayer, people have probably read books written by him, essential that rodents have ready access to the bait. So you have to have a continuous supply. Now with that, you can see if this is your rodent population and it's decreasing slowly over time, and this is the bait you're putting in, you top your bait up, it slowly goes down, you top it up, it goes down. Each time you top it up, it goes down a little bit less and a little bit less until you get to the end of your control program where you top it up and it actually never goes down. And that's when you know you have control. You need to follow it frequently. I've got 5. I'm going to run over time, guys. So I apologize, but I'm not that sorry. Frequently, over the first 10 days, you need to make sure that you top it up continuously. Okay? Insufficient amount of baits will provide suboptimal results within this equation. It's a saturation bait. So you've got to be aware of non-target animals, because even those can take lethal doses in there as well. Increased primary risks, increased secondary risks. How we can start to mitigate some of those risks? Well, we can have a look at another process called pulse baiting. Again, Duboc, who developed pulse baiting specifically for brodifocum, with this said that within dominance hierarchies, within these populations, you can control them within waves, and you can use this lag period, this 3 to 5 day lag period, to your benefit within this. Because unlike traditional saturation baits, the idea is to actually use small bait points and let them to reduce to 0. Okay? Higher toxicity baits are applied, but in smaller quantities, reducing as the population decreases. And so this is what this ends up looking like. It looks a little bit like this. You replace the bait at frequent pulse intervals, initially after 3 days and then at 7-day intervals. And it means that target pests are going to be unable to significantly overconsume because there simply just isn't the volume of bait to do. This reduction in bait volume reduces both the primary and the secondary risks that you occur. So if it looks a bit like this, you do your pulse on day 1, that bait is totally consumed and you kill that initial hierarchy, that initial dominant group, and then your subdominant group, and then your juveniles and your non-dominant animals whatsoever. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Less bait used, less bait going into the environment. To look at this another way, you can have a look at some trials that BASF have done in the past, and you can see here that there's an overlap. With a saturation bait, you are having a significant number of visits, more so than you would think actually within that. And you have complete control between day 22 and day 28. Using things like AVK single feeds, you do a pulse, you wait for that initial population to perish over that 3 to 5 day window. You do a pulse, guarantees that the next animals getting hold of some of that bait will not have initially or previously consumed any. You do another pulse. So you are pulse baiting, you are going in doses, and you use less bait, you come back less often. It's a more effective tool. Finally, we have speed baiting, which is specifically for use around the cholecalciferols. It was actually designed and patented by BASF, but it's a great tool for using any of the cholecalciferol baits available on the market. And it works at a population level as a saturation bait. But I remember mentioning before that cholecalciferol has a stop feed effect. After 24 hours, that animal will stop feeding, not just on the bait, but on all food whatsoever. So actually on an individual level, it's working as a pulse bait. That's a bit mad, right? So when we have a look at the stop feed effect, I mentioned before, you have these calciferous lumps that will start to grow relatively quickly as soon as that calciferol is starting to be metabolized. And sometimes, almost always, you get calcium deposits on the stomach and around the intestinal tract. And this will cause the animal to stop eating anymore. So not only do you save bait, but you stop overconsumption. So you will have a saturation with the environment, but you will have a pulse bait happening on an individual level. Historically, when calciferol was available back in the 70s and 80s, we had problems with it because it simply wasn't palatable enough to get this stop feed effect occurring rapidly enough. And in fact, it had to be mixed with other chemicals such as diphenocone. But today's formulations are hyper palatable, and within which you can get a lethal dose within that animal, within a single night, within that 24-hour period. And then you have this stop feed effect occurring as a result of that. So we have a stop feed effect, and that will cause this pulse bait to occur within this. So to put this in another graphical format, we have a stop feed effect, less bait used, less contamination, reduces the spread of disease and damage. Happy days. If you then compare this then to our traditional methods, we have our saturation baits, which is what everyone uses, and we have this overlapping overconsumption occurring. We have our pulse baits, which we said before, much more effective, especially when using our single feed AVKs. With our speed baiting, you are having that same pulse effect, but occurring on an individual level. So you can get control very rapidly indeed. And in fact, what it means then is we not only reduce the risks of secondary poisoning by using a calciferol, but we reduce the risks of a primary poisoning as well, because the bait is down for a shorter period of time. If the bait's down for a shorter period of time, then at that point, there is lower primary risk because there's simply not the bait in the environment to be consumed by the wrong animals. Now, Niall, do I have time to keep on talking?
You got a couple more minutes. You've only got one question so far, so
get your questions in now, guys. Very quickly, the last part of this deployment strategy we talk about is the use of monitors in conjunction with any bait. So there are monitors out there for AVKs, there are monitors out there for calciferols, there are monitors out there for just about any product out there. And monitors are a fantastic tool because actually they do two things. Number one, they're an early warning system. Okay, that being said, if you are a diligent and reliable pest manager, you should be your own early warning system. It simply just helps add to that picture. But what these do by far and away is monitoring baits. They will they are like a pre-describer that they will get the rodents in that environment switched on to the active material that you are wanting to use later on. They reduce the risks in areas and times when you don't have any animals up on the site. And then when you do have rodents on the site, you can switch over. That pickup is instantaneously because they have pre-qualified. That's what I'm looking for. They've pre-qualified that bait as safe to consume. And in fact, even on studies done around a zoo in the UK, we found that when we were using monitoring pastes as a pre-census for this, the uptake of the active material was significantly higher after that lag period because they had pre-qualified themselves and they preconditioned themselves to consume that bait. It means that within that, actually, you're reducing the risks at all points leading up to your infestation occurring, and you are then subsequently reducing the risks of primary poisoning at all points after you have controlled that population as well. Now, last one, we talk about deployment, and this is it. I will rush through this. Where we put our bait is also going to have a major impact on the risks presented to the environment, okay? It's likely this is the point that everyone hyperfixates on first. This is where we actually assume the risk is. We don't consider any of these other processes prior to that. This is the bit that we hyperfixate on. And my big takeaway from today is this is a part of this whole process. Consider it for sure, but it should be the last thing that we consider after all others, okay? Because as we can see, we should have a range of mitigations out there first. Deployment, we have a variety of different ways to do it. TRBs, covered and protected, sewers and burrows, permanent and open areas. There's a tool for each one. They come with their own benefits and they come with their own risks. Understand them, choose the right deployment method to mitigate those risks and still have the maximum impact to the target population that you are trying to control. IPM over IRM. This is IPM. IPM, prevent, detect, control. IRM is what we have just discussed in this whole lecture today. It's the integration of risk within our IPM strategy. Why do we keep talking about this? It's not just about what we use, it's about how we are going to use it. We manage our risk through our knowledge, our skills, and our professional behaviors. All rodenticide are tools, and we choose to wield them either like a hammer or like a scalpel, okay? So at the end of the day, use these tools with precision. Find the right tool for the right job. Having a complete toolkit allows us to develop precise strategies for the maximum impact for the minimum cost. There are tools by manufacturers out there and marketing bump. With that, pick the right tool for the right job. There's a lot of formulation technology goes into a lot of our formulations. The manufacturers will put a huge amount of time, I can attest to this, into making these formulations as effective as possible. Right, I've only overgone by 4 minutes, which is good for me. It's good for me. There we go. I actually put some extra slides in the end thinking I might do this a little bit too soon. There we go. How are you feeling?
Oh, no. But I mean, you say 4, I say 5. We can discuss that later. But no, well done. No, great presentation. Thank you again for going through that again for us. Got a couple of questions. We have one around internal mouse jobs in inner city London, a huge sort of risk of secondary poisoning through sort of domestic cats and stuff. I understand there's going to be a lot of variables in the question. But how many poisoned mice would have to be consumed for an average size cat to show symptoms of secondary poisoning?
So let's talk about LD50 first, because this is a bit of a bugbear of mine. So LD50 is the lethal dose required to kill 50% of a population. And it seems like a bit of an arbitrary metric, because why are we wanting to do just half of the population? But it's used in toxicology, and it's what's used in toxicology so we can have a level playing field, so we can understand how product A compares to product B, compares to paracetamol, compares to Vimto. So we use the LD50s, but you have to understand that LD50 is a curve, depending on which way you're looking at it. It means that, let's say it takes 10 grams of difenycoum to kill a rat. That's an average. Some rats, it may only take 3 grams. Other rats, it may take 17 grams, okay? So we are grading on a curve. So with that, we also have data out there for, let's say, rats, mice, cats, dogs, pigs. But it is all on a curve. So with that, if you say something like, and you can go onto the BPCA webpage, and I know that it's on there, there are LD50 charts, LD50 tables, which will say what that 50% ratio is in order for different animals to be rolled over, to perish as a result of consuming that. Long and the short of it is you should try and not allow for any secondary poisoning, because you may be using maybe a cat which is very tolerant. You might have another cat which is very intolerant. So you cannot prescribe any safe limit. All you can do is look on that table and say which of these chemicals are cats least reactive to. And is that going to be the right chemical from the job? That falls into part of your substitution. If you're worried about secondary poisoning risks and not about primary poisoning risks, then you choose an active material that has lower secondary poisoning risks, something like a calciferol. But again, is that balance between what is greater, the risk of primary poisoning or the risk of secondary poisoning? If the risk of primary poisoning is higher, then you use something like an AVK and you choose the right AVK accordingly. Secondary, use a calciferol. That's a very long answer to a very short question. But actually, I'm going to be honest with you, that is the very short answer to it. It's a very complicated subject. Happy to have this discussion offline to anyone who wants to have it later on.
Awesome. So Alex has now volunteered himself for a webinar next year. Thank you very much, Alex.
I like the answer.
So you had another one around palatability. So they have said that they are finding bromadiolone wheat grains more attractive than cilantro. Why?
I love the fact that why is that? It's in capital letters. There's a whole host of factors. So rodents can become very habitual in their eating habits. So with that, if they are already highly predisposed to eating grain, to take this back a bit, rodents are inherently like nervous animals. They suffer from neophobia. They will they will highly habituate onto things. They will stick to things that they know are safe because the unknown will kill you. Okay. So with that, if you have an animal that's been eating nothing but grain and you present it with something completely new and novel, then it will eventually try that, but not until all other options have gone. So if you are looking to use a food source which is significantly different from the food source that they're habitually eating on, restrict that initial food source, force them out of their comfort zone, force them to actually look and forage. Cilantro is a very palatable bait. However, there are horses for courses. There are no silver bullets in this industry. If anyone tells you that there is a silver bullet, there is one product that'll do all things at all time, kick them in the shins because they're lying to you. There are simply the right tools for the right time. And cilantro is a phenomenal tool when used in the right situations. And those are broad and varied. There we go.
There we go. Thank you very much. And again, that's a question that can obviously spill into lots of times in nursing habits and all sorts. And
oh, yes. I'm trying to be brief, but I could talk about this for hours. I'm sorry.
We've got 4 minutes, so I'll rattle through as many questions as we can. When will cilantro be approved for burrow baiting? And they need it now, apparently. Do we have an update?
Of course, I cannot go into the commercials and regulatory processes of products. However, what I can tell you is cilantro is going through its approval processes at the moment in the EU and in the UK BPR. And so that will occur in October. And you'll just have to wait and see what things we've put and applied to put on the label after October.
There we go. October, that is when you'll get the update. So we've had another one around why we don't have a wheat formulation for cholecalciferol. Was it previously back in the 80s a wheat formulation?
It was a canary seed formulation. The problem with calciferol than wheat, broadly speaking, it's a technical issue rather than an efficacy issue. So if you think about it, wheat, where do you put the toxic component of your formulation? It goes on the outside. It coats the outside. Now, cholecalciferol, the reason that formulations have to be palatable. They have to be uber palatable because actually cholecalciferol itself at 750 ppm can be detected by rodents. Most other baits, it's 50 ppm. It sits below that 100 ppm threshold of being able to be tasted by most animals. Cholecalciferol, 750 ppm, it can be tasted. And as such, the formulations tend to have a lot of very clever formulation technology to make them palatable. And that formulation technology is spread homogeneously through that entire block or pasta sachet. With a wheat formulation, all of that technology has to sit just on the outside of the wheat, which compounds that issue of taste profile. You simply just can't get enough technology onto the outside of a wheat kernel, then you would be able to overcome this taste thing. We are looking at it. Everyone's looking at it, okay, because it's one of those things there. But as it stands, it's just not technically feasible to go down that route. And so we have other options up our sleeve, so to speak. And again, it's a watch this space moment, because formulation technology is always developing, it's always working. But as it stands, that's why we have had issues, and historically had issues with cholecalciferol in the past. It's a volume to surface area relation issue. If that makes sense.
There we go. Thank you very much. And actually, I managed to run slightly short. So again, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again for Alex for doing the talk. Some really great questions. And I think it certainly, I think, helps having these questions to understand why it's just rodenticide. We just throw it on a product. Not necessarily. There's lots of things to consider.
Yeah.
All that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Just because they all come in a bucket and look roughly the same shape and weight, and we put them in a bait box, doesn't mean they're the same. They do very different things. Even within the AVKs, there is a whole range of different ways to use them. And then when you move to calciferols, it's a completely different ballgame. So know your products, know your AIs, get that impact out of them, reduce those costs.
Amazing. Thank you again. And what a great tagline to finish that one up on. I would take that on a t-shirt. Great. Thank you very much. I also do believe that, as Alex has now prompted a social media post with regards to Best Pest clothing. So if anyone has any Best Pest clothing, make sure you go and check out our socials.